Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just glad you could join us on this kind of soggy day today. We'll be in session 9, page 82 of the quarterly, and the title of it is, I Am He. Now, Jesus is always in control and committed to the redemption of humanity. So keep that in mind, that He's always in control. You know, the lesson today is going to be taken from John 18, verses 1 through 11. And we're going to kind of look a little bit at some of the things. And I just want to know, if most of you are like me, we have mistaken somebody for somebody else. We looked at the person and thought, I know that person. And then you may even go up to them and tap them on the shoulder thinking it is. But then you discover that it's not who you thought they were. We could be embarrassed about it, amused, or even relieved. Sometimes we just make mistakes about people like that. See, the same thing happened in the garden that night that Jesus and the disciples went there after the Passover. You see, some people mistake other people even after they tell them who they are. So there was no way to mistake Jesus for someone else. These guards and stuff who went to the garden that night should have had no reason to mistake Jesus for somebody else. Not like us who mistake other people for some people sometimes. See, not only did the guards know him, they probably seen him preaching in the synagogues, but Judas knew him as well. And he actually identified him with a kiss to the cheek. And Jesus boldly stated, I am He. He was not afraid of Judas or the mob. This was His hour. So let's go into understanding the context just a little bit. We can see in the upper room, Jesus began His prayer with, Father, the hour has come. That's in John chapter 17, verse 1, where you'll see that. It was time. As Jesus and His disciples crossed the Jordan Brook on the eastern side of Jerusalem, they ascended the Mount of Olives. And Jesus often resorted to the garden for prayer during His journeys to Jerusalem. Now, being familiar with this mountainside retreat, Judas knew where to bring the soldiers assigned by the chief priest to arrest Jesus. See, the torch-bearing mob shouted the peace of this place of prayer as they moved cautiously to seize the Lord. Now, listen to what I'm going to tell you. Jesus knew what was happening. He knew from the very beginning what was going to happen. So He asked the officials with Judas who they were seeking. And when they replied, Jesus firmly stated, I am He. The power of His presence and the authority of His manner strongly impacted the crowd as they fell back to the ground. Fell back to the ground. So He asked the question again. When He affirmed He was the one, the soldiers moved forward to take Him. Now, Jesus' disciples are there with Him. Keep that in mind. But they were not so quick to give up. Peter drew a sword and apparently tried to cut the head off of a servant of the high priest. But he only sliced his ear off. And see, this could have resulted in Peter's arrest. But Jesus healed the man and rebuked Peter. If he wanted to resist, Jesus had angelic armies on whom He could call to defend Him and destroy His enemies. Now that's found in Matthew chapter 26, verse 53. When the soldiers made no move to seize Peter or the others, The disciples fled into the night. You see, the mob was not interested in them. They only wanted Jesus. So let's go into our text today, and we're going to see that the first 3 verses are kind of a show of force. So let's read verse 1. After Jesus had said these things, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, and he knew his disciples. He and his disciples went into it. Now, at the supper that night, I'm sure the disciples were trying to figure out what Jesus had said. So can you imagine what the disciples were thinking after Jesus had said these things? Jesus had spoken to them about the necessity of being a servant as he washed their feet. He had foretold Judas' betrayal and that they would face persecutions. He had instructed them to love one another as he had loved them. He spoke of praying in his name and abiding in him. He said he was returning to the Father and would be sending the counselor who would be with them always. He had told them their sorrow would be turned to joy. See, the disciples had much to think about as they left the upper room that night. So can you imagine what they were thinking after Jesus had said all these things? See, walking westward, they crossed the Kidron Valley, which ran north and south between the walled city of Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. Because Passover was celebrated at the full moon, the disciples would have had adequate light for crossing the valley. See, the Greek word translated garden can refer to any cultivated plot of land, from a small patch to a large orchard or plantation. So Jesus and his disciples went into the garden. And the garden was called Gethsemane. John called it a garden in his gospel. Luke simply called it the place in his gospel. See, the other gospel writers stated Jesus prayed while in the garden and asked the Father to let this cup pass from him. See, John's gospel does not mention that until later. Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to join him in the garden to pray with him, since he was deeply grieved to the point of death. See, the 3 were weary from a long day, and they kept falling asleep while Jesus prayed. Now, Luke mentioned in his gospel that Jesus fervently prayed. His sweat fell to the ground like drops of blood. And that's in Luke chapter 22, verse 44. Let's look at verse 2 now. Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. Let's go ahead and do verse 3 also. So Judas took a company of soldiers and some officials with the chief priests and the Pharisees and came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. You see, Jesus often met his disciples at this location because Judas had undoubtedly been with Jesus on these earlier visits. He knew where to find him. Judas brought a company of soldiers with him. Now, a company of soldiers could mean up to 600 soldiers. Now, these Roman soldiers who were stationed at the annual fortress on the northeast corner of Jerusalem, they accompanied him. Now, accompanying these soldiers were some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. See, this group would have been part of the temple police. The temple police would have served as the arresting officers. And the weapons that they carried with them indicated they expected resistance. See, the Jews and Romans were determined to take Jesus into custody and were ready to use whatever and as much force as was necessary to do so. They were ready to use force. They took weapons with them, clubs, sticks, swords. They were there to use force if needed be to take Jesus. Let's look on over into the next set of verses. Now, this is going to be about positive identification. And we're going to look at verses 4 through 7. Then Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, went out and said to them, "Who is it that you're seeking?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth. They answered. Jesus said, "I am he." Jesus told him. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing there. When Jesus told them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Who is it that you're seeking?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. "I told you I am he," Jesus replied. "So if you're looking for me, let these men go." Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen, was an affirmation of Christ's sovereign omniscience. Judas' betrayal did not take him by surprise. He knew it. He knew who was going to betray him. He knew when he was going to betray him. He knew how he would identify him. Jesus knew it all. And by choosing to be in this location at this moment, Jesus was showing that he was orchestrating each detail of his betrayal and arrest. He knew what moves were coming next. He was in charge, not Judas, not the Romans, and not the temple police. Christ is always in charge. So stepping forward that night, Jesus said, "Who is it that you're seeking?" And he would repeat this question verbatim in just a few minutes later. They responded with Jesus of Nazareth. This was their official answer. See, they would reply again as well. The title would again be used for Jesus. It was on the sign that hung above his head on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus replied by simply saying, "I am." Again, using the Father's name for himself and thereby affirming his divinity. See, when Jesus had earlier used a name for himself, the religious leaders took up stones to kill him. But what happened this time, though, was dramatically different. In an incredible and uniquely display of Christ's lordship, this speaking the divine name causes enemies to step back and fall to the ground. Can you imagine hundreds of armed soldiers falling on the ground helplessly, like dominoes going? See, this scene screams that Jesus had all the power. He was in complete control. And that Judas was standing with them indicates he also fell backwards. Having made his divine identity known through the spoken word, Jesus again asked these armed men who were lying on the ground, "Who is it that you're seeking?" Now, the soldiers did not speak with as much vigor and authority this time as they replied, "Jesus of Nazareth." Although this crowd did not recognize his deity, they could not ignore his power. Now, I'm going to go ahead and read verse 9. I read verse 8 also just a few minutes ago. This was to fulfill the words he had said, "I have not lost one of those you have given me." See, by asking a second time and having the soldiers repeat the reply, Jesus was clarifying that there was no need to arrest anybody but him alone. And saying, "I told you I am he," he was distinguishing himself from his disciples. This time, though, Jesus would give the order, "Let these men go." And that was referring to his disciples. So, "Who do you think you are to give us orders?" they asked him. "You do what we say, not the other way around." In giving this order, Jesus was putting himself between his followers and the enemy. Of Christ had positioned himself as a sacrifice to protect his own. He revealed himself to be the good shepherd who willingly gave his life for his sheep. So Jesus showed them that they were not in control. They could say all day long, "Who do you think you are to give us orders?" Jesus was in control. He gave the orders. Your Christ showed a display of physical protection in a snapshot. He gave a snapshot of the spiritual and eternity security that only Jesus can give. You know, that the disciples weren't taken into custody again underscores that Jesus was in full control of what happened in the garden that night. No one was in more control than Jesus Christ was. And it also fulfilled what Jesus had said earlier in his prayer in the upper room. While I was with them, I was protecting them by your name that you have given me. I guarded them, and not one of them is lost, except the son of destruction. That's in John 17, verse 12. Now, we're going to see where the rebellion snubbed. What is it? We'll look through verses 10 to 11 as we finish up here. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword drew, struck the high priest's servant's ear and cut off the right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. At that time, Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?" So we can see that Jesus snubbed that rebellion right there. You know, after having seen the remarkable display of Christ's power, the disciples probably felt emboldened. They felt brave. They asked the Lord, "Should we strike with the sword?" Now, Simon Peter, we know how he was. He was caught up in the wave of courage and did not wait for a reply. He drew the sword and cut off the right ear of Malchus, who was the high priest's servant. See, Peter was likely aiming for his head, because earlier that evening Peter declared he would die for Jesus. And that's Matthew 26, verse 35. See, in this moment, he was in danger of doing just that. See, Jesus stopped Peter's attack. If Jesus had not intervened, the soldiers probably would have responded with deadly force, or at least seized Peter and the other disciples. Luke said the disciples had two swords. That Simon Peter was probably not the only one carrying a weapon. Luke also included the fact that Jesus touched and restored Malchus' ear. That's in Luke chapter 22, verses 38 and verse 51. We can see that this defensive scene in the garden highlights two truths. First, Jesus did not need defending. He had already shown that the most formidable soldiers of his day were powerless against just his spoken word. Jesus had at his beck and call legions of angels who would have readily appeared and stepped forward in order to protect him. Second, the scene is a reminder that the disciples were still thinking Jesus was going to be a political leader. They had earlier heard the crowds as they attempted to crown Jesus as their king. They had seen the throngs cheering him as he rode into the city on the back of a donkey. And all the way to the ascension, the Lord's disciples were expecting some type of military or political takeover. That was what was behind their question. "Lord, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel at this time?" Jesus understood their desire for power, but he explained that the power they would receive would be from the Holy Spirit, who would commission them to be his witness, who he would commission him to be as his witness in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Jesus would now empower them to be his warriors, but also his witnesses. He would not empower them to be warriors in a political arena. That was not Christ's whole intent in coming to earth. It wasn't to be political. It wasn't to be a warrior. He come as a savior. You see, knowing his glorification would not come through political or military acts. Jesus challenged Simon Peter, "Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?" Now, few at that time knew this would be the cup of God's fury, his judgment on a sinful world. That's in Isaiah 51:22 and Revelations 14:10. Jesus was always obedient to the Father. And Jesus said, "For I have come down from heaven, not to do my will, but do the will of him who sent me." That's in John chapter 6, verse 38. Recognizing it to be the Father's will, Jesus would willingly drink from that cup. So it wasn't to take over by political force or military force. Jesus came to do the Father's will, and that was to save a sinful world. Now, believers can expect the enemies of Jesus to use maximum force against him and us. But we can confidently face life knowing that Jesus is in charge. No matter what's thrown at us, we know that Jesus is in charge. And we need to obediently involve ourselves in God's redemptive plan. Well, that's the lesson for today. I hope you enjoyed it. And please read John chapter 18, verses 1 through 11, and find out for yourself who Jesus really is. I am he. I am. I hope you have a great day. God bless you all until we see each other again next week.